My name is Viktoria Rusunaitė. In Vilnius Institute for Policy Analysis, I'm heading the European Security Program. And an inherent part of what we do is analysis of disinformation. We monitor it, we analyze it, we teach media literacy. And we gathered you here today on the occasion of recently published reports on Russian propaganda efforts in the Baltics and the wider region, authored by Lukas Andriukaitis, who is with us here today. While in the normal circumstances, we would probably present these reports and have a little discussion in our venue on Didžioji Street in Vilnius, and we would be joined by local experts. But quarantine, along with restrictions, bring us the opportunity to introduce here people from all over region that we follow and respect. And we're very happy today have here with us the regional leaders of disinformation research from Ukraine and Belarus. I would say both countries among the hotspots of propaganda and Kremlin disinformation in Europe. And well, we already experienced that pandemic exposed numerous vulnerabilities in our respective societies. And as ever, Kremlin's propaganda is ready to exploit them all. And in the first weeks of quarantine, reading and watching the news was one of the coping strategies for societies faced with the unknown and with the settings of isolation and physical distancing. And this context has become a breeding ground for manipulations, conspiracy theories, and fringe narratives. And among steady targets of Kremlin's disinfo today is, of course, Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltics. Ukraine has been heavily targeted since 2014. In Belarus, aiming to assert its power, Kremlin is not satisfied with the union state format anymore, with exerting influence through subsidies, but it also heavily targets Belarusian society during the last few years, promoting pro-Kremlin points of view. And in the Baltics, among main targets are Baltic economic situation and NATO. So we are gathered here today to learn what kind of fixing has COVID-19 brought into already toxic Kremlin's propaganda cocktail. From Ukraine today, we have Lyubov Cybulska, who is the leader of a hybrid warfare analytical group in Ukraine Crisis Media Center since 2018, with a background in journalism and governmental advisory roles in strategic communication. Lyubov is one of the leading analysts on propaganda and disinformation in Ukraine, so we are very happy to have her here with us today. From Belarus, we're joined by Andrei Yeliseev, who is a research director at the Warsaw-based East Center. And propaganda and disinformation research in Belarus is gaining more traction and popularity in the recent couple of years. And Andrei has researched and discussed disinformation in media extensively. He is one of the best-known researchers from Belarus on this topic, and one of the people you turn to when you want to talk about disinformation in Belarus. So we're happy to have him here today as well. And of course, representing Vilnius Institute for Policy Analysis and DFR Lab at Atlantic Council is Lukas Andriukaitis, who is also the author of recently published study, Russian Propaganda Efforts in the Baltics and the wider region. Among other things, Lukas is an experienced training in open source methodologies on how to research disinformation and propaganda. And in his new paper, he summarized his experience of a few years of research on Russian propaganda. So let's kick this off and start with Lukas Andriukaitis. Lukas, the floor is yours.
Hello, thank you. Let me quickly share my slides and we can begin. I hope you all hear me well. My name is Lukas Andriukaitis. As Victoria mentioned, I've been cooperating with Vilnius Institute for over 2 years now, working on various research cases concerning the Baltic states and the wider region. And today is a perfect opportunity to quickly introduce my latest report on the propaganda efforts in the Baltics and the wider region. And since we have such wonderful experts from other countries, I will mainly focus on the Baltic examples today. So in this paper, I briefly looked into main 5 criteria that can define the Kremlin propaganda in the Baltics and abroad. And also I introduced 5 of the recommendations that I found over the years working with disinformation that would be the most useful to implement to fight it efficiently. So without further ado, let's go through the main criteria that I expect to find the most pro-Kremlin disinfo here. The first one is that Kremlin disinformation is repetitive, and very similar stories can appear in different countries. A lot of you might have heard about the Lisa case in Germany, where Ukrainian colleagues most likely heard similar rape narratives in Ukraine. But we also had very similar examples in Lithuania, and they were targeted at NATO soldiers, allegedly German soldiers raping girls in Lithuania. But this was quite quickly debunked, but it shows how the same stories can be recycled throughout the region. We also noticed a lot of stories targeting NATO troops to be overlapping. But more importantly, if we Google keywords using social media listening tools, NATO and the Baltic states, we can see that a large majority of the most engaged with content coming between 2016 and 2018 was basically dominated by pro-Russian media. The other sort of overlapping criteria is that Kremlin disinformation is spread on various channels, and this is quite interesting because Sputnik News in Lithuania and the Baltic region is not considered to be a very influential social media network. But what we noticed is that their Facebook follower pages are increasing dramatically, very rapidly. Here you can see in the graph the situation. And this is quite concerning because these real Facebook users are following these Facebook profiles, and they get this information directly into their feeds in very short messages, which might influence them more than the actual articles of the media outlet. The other thing is quite different. I'm not sure if this was in any other country in the broader region, but from Lithuania and from the Baltic states, kids were recruited to go to these paramilitary camps in Russia, which were basically designed to stoke pro-Soviet memories and the brotherhood of nations ideas. And basically, they were taken not from only Russian-speaking schools, but also from Lithuanian-speaking schools, and sort of invited to come for free to spend a couple of weeks in this, pro-Soviet narrative environment. Number 3 is Kremlin narratives can be based on facts, but not necessarily. This may come as the least of the surprises, but basically the pro-Kremlin disinformation can be very inventive in the narrative scene. And what we notice is that a lot of keywords in English language, such as Russophobic, anti-NATO hysteria, Russophobia, NATO aggression, is dominated by very specific pro-Kremlin media outlets. And this is quite interesting. This was 2 years of scope of analysis, but as we can see, these key terms are being very precisely used to stoke by specific media outlets and to stoke specific feelings. Also, we see a lot of narratives just being invented out of the blue, and one of the best examples is that Lithuania wants to incorporate Kaliningrad into its territory, which was basically targeted for Russian speakers, and I think for very clear reasons to stoke fear, amongst the Kaliningrad region and other Russian speakers that Lithuania is not only hosting NATO troops but also are aggressive about their territorial gains around its territory. The fourth one is that Kremlin disinformation is opportunistic, and I think this is one of the key ones. They're very good at reacting at what's happening and pushing some specific messaging. For us, as brothers, our resistance after World War II is a very sensitive topic, and what we notice is that they're very quick to react to anything that is happening at home. and to provide, a different narrative for the Russian speakers. So whenever our forest brothers received any medals at home, or if remains of some of them were found somewhere, the Russian propaganda would step in with their articles presenting narratives in Russian and English languages, or even in Lithuanian language to counter these news. The fifth one and the last one is that Kremlin disinformation is innovative, and we should never forget that. I think we should always try to think outside of the box. And one of my favorite examples is how Sputnik News use backlinks. So backlinks is the link that directs to a specific websites, and the more links you have from different websites, the more likely that Google or any other research mechanisms will favor your results. So basically what we noticed is that Sputnik News created this information environments where they backlink to each other's stories, basically from various different outlets. And in this way they propagate the chances and increase the chances that their articles will be higher in the Google search. And they're in perfect position to do that because they have media outlets in different countries, and they're very easy to do that. So I would like to stop here, and all of the questions you might have about the disinformation in regards to coronavirus or any more recent examples, I'll be very happy to answer in the discussion part. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucas. Yes, let's have questions and answers in the Q&A tab that you see on the bottom of your screen. Next, we'll go to the situation in Belarus, and Andrei Yeliseu, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Victoria, for organizing this webinar. I used to live in each of 3 Baltic states and Ukraine for about 4 years, so this topic is close to me, not only from professional point of view, but also personally. Great insights from Lucas' presentation. Some of the conclusions corroborated with my findings. Some are entirely new. Like, for instance, I didn't see claims about Lithuania's aggressive intentions towards Kaliningrad region in Sputnik Belarus or other pro-Kremlin outlets targeting Belarus. I'd like to show you one slide from my recent research on Sputnik Belarus, based on consistent monitoring throughout 2019. Let me zoom it in for you. So I classify all the disinformation, a multitude of disinformation cases into 12 main propaganda narratives. And some of them specifically target either Ukraine or the Baltic states and Poland. So as you can see, number 1, I placed the narrative about Putin in question the Belarusian identity and promoting the so-called Russian world. Then you can see number 2, 3, 4, 5 different propaganda narratives targeting Ukraine, discredited in many ways, claiming that Ukraine is a pro-fascist country which is not sovereign. Then we can see at 7 and 8 concrete propaganda narratives targeting the Baltic states. So there are many materials published in Sputnik Belarus and other pro-Kremlin outlets about social and economic degradation in the Baltic countries. That's the Baltic countries and Poland are not sovereign, puppets of the United States. And then you can see also some other propaganda narratives targeting the so-called collective West. Some of these narratives are used to discredit the Baltic countries too. Various conspiracies, like last year one of the commentators to Sputnik Belarus alleged that virtually all politicians in the Baltic states are implicated in pedophilia. This way, a larger Western countries control the Baltic states. So a variety of ridiculous conspiracy claims. But it is better to see once a video compilation. It's worth 1,000 words. So let me show you a video compilation me and my colleagues did of parts of Sputnik Belarus programs targeting the Baltic states, Ukraine, and promoting the Russian world concept. So I hope that you can see it.
В Латвии давно Латвия стала одной Ригой, а в остальной части ходят мишки.
Ну, Латвия, извините, кто она является в Евросоюзе? Они не имеют там никакого суверенитета, да, у них есть флаг, герб, но у них практически нет экономики.
Европейский Союз – это не суверенный союз, в общем-то, независимости на сегодняшний день он не обладает, причем ни военной, ни политической, соответственно.
Государством Украину назвать очень сложно, потому что внешнее воздействие, да.
Ну, это скорее государственное образование.
Это структура, да,
ну,
вот это вот, да. Проектно-конструкторское государство.
Где...
Получается, на выборах в Верховную Раду победил Сорос. Две партии Сороса, которые фактически взяли большинство.
Фактически Госдепартамент США и посольство Соединенных Штатов это стала такой гауляйтерская структура, надстройка над государством.
Да, ну я точно знаю, вот в Совете министров Украины, да, того периода, там, на определенном этаже, на 5-м, да, он был вообще весь отдан американским специалистам.
Россия – это не только та территория Российской Федерации, которая ныне существует, а историческая Россия – это есть фактически территория бывшего СССР.
То русский народ – это народ, состоящий из белорусов, малороссов и великороссов. Вот когда это три, то это русский народ.
Я имею в виду статуты Великого княжества Литовского. Вот.
Который был, кстати, написан на русском языке.
Да.
А тот, кто пытается разрушить союз и так далее, это не патриот Беларуси. Он работает в интерес... Он или просто глупый человек, или противник белорусского государства и белорусского народа.
Сегодня день рождения, кстати, у Владимира Владимировича, да?
Поздравляем.
То есть,
поздравляем.
Да, с днем рождения, товарищ главком России.
So, as you can see, entirely this multitude of cases and narratives can be presented in just a couple of sentences. That's the West in all its manifestations is very bad and aggressive in contrast to good and high moral Russia. And so that's the only way of positive development for Belarus is to be in a close alliance with Russia. Now let me show you another slide about some recent propaganda claims related to coronavirus outbreak. So all these narratives that I showed you remain, but due to the coronavirus outbreak, they take some new modifications. So you can see some of the recent claims on the slides that the NATO military spread coronavirus in the Baltic states, that the Baltic states and other EU countries, they use this complicated period of time in order to promote their harmful policies, like an alleged rise of neo-Nazi policies in Latvia and larger oppression of Russian-speaking population. One of the Sputnik Belarus publications claimed that Lithuania actually wishes to sideline Belarus from coronavirus-related international aid. This claim appeared after critical words by Lithuanian presidents about Belarus' strategy of fighting the coronavirus outbreak. Then, of course, a number of publications alleging that the Belarusian opposition, civil society, and independent media are involved in a West or NATO-driven mission to infect as many Belarusians as possible. Some publications even allege that opposition members are paid by NATO or the West to infect others, and that the opposition was allegedly paid to cancel the Victory Day military parade. So these are some of the recent claims which are well suited in the bad West narratives, but are now presented in some newer modification due to the coronavirus epidemic. I think I'll stop here. So thank you.
Thank you, Andrei. Now we will give the floor to Lyubov Tsibulska.
Hi, thank you so much. Thank you for organizing this event, and it's my pleasure to be part of it. And I just realized that 3 years ago I worked at the Cabinet of Ministers on the 6th floor, and now I'm regretting that I didn't check what's going on 5th with those Americans. Yes, indeed, the Ukraine also is facing, as many other countries, facing huge, powerful disinformation flow with regard to the virus, and which is not surprised because any crisis is a great precondition for disinformation. I'd like to share with you some points on main disinformation platforms in Ukraine. First of all, these are pro-Russian media and social media, especially messengers. With regard to pro-Russian media, in 2016, Ukraine has banned Russian media, and it took Kremlin few years to shape up and launch local Ukrainian, seemingly Ukrainian media, but totally with Russian content, pro-Russian content. So technically they are Ukrainian, they have Ukrainian ownership documents, but in fact they promote pro-Russian politicians and Russian narratives. And it's quite difficult somehow to restrict them or ban them, because otherwise it would be called censorship. So, but we see clearly that the scheme of budgeting are very dubious, not transparent there. And of course, there are a lot of questions on who they're working for. With regard to social media, we see that Telegram and Viber are especially popular in Ukraine. Of course, Facebook and Twitter are also spreading disinformation, but at least these two platforms somehow combat disinformation. But in Telegram and Viber, you can easily create your own groups, your channels with on specific topics with very specific newsfeed, and it gained popularity in Ukraine, and especially during election campaigns. They acquired a lot of groups, spread disinformation, and acquired a lot of followers due to posting information, compromising information on candidates, leaks, and so on. And of course, these messengers have less barriers, and it's easier, much easier to share information within circles of people who know each other, with some living communities, with school groupings, groups and hobbies, and so on. So these two messengers are especially unprotected and dangerous in terms of disinformation. I'd also like to tell a few words about main tasks of Russian disinformation in Ukraine. So first of all, it's undermining trust to government institutions, undermining trust to independent media and generally democratic institutions, spreading anxiety, chaos, sometimes panic, and of course polarization of society. And you asked us to think about change of tactics. So with regard to tactics, I think that we don't see the significant change of main tasks and tactics, and but we do see the tactical use of different situations. So and that's like basically Kremlin's toolkit is quite well known and established and stable, I would say. And it's not just about disinformation. Let's look at their secret service, right? And the very good example here is the latest developments in Prague. The news about Prague's mayor and that he was about to be poisoned by Russian secret service, and now he's under 24/7 police guard because allegedly Kremlin wanted to poison him with the deadly poison ricin. So it just shows that having such a bad track record, right, on poisoning, Kremlin still doesn't stop using the same tactic. And the poisoning itself has been in Kremlin's portfolio for many years, I guess since Ivan the Terrible. But they still do not quit their favorite tricks, right? And the same with disinformation. KGB started spreading fakes on AIDS manufactured in American labs in 60s. And just recently, another example, we had stories about Lugar Center and developing, again, by the Americans, biological weapon against Russians. And now we have a story about the US labs in Ukraine creating COVID. So the narratives and tactic is the same, the concept general is the same, but technologies are different and stories, situations, topics are different. And I think that that's what we should focus on elaboration, we as civil society and government, on elaboration, our reaction on these tactics and the Russian main narratives. Let me stop here. You said I have only 7 minutes, and then we will proceed with questions and answers.
Yes, thank you, Lubov, for a very interesting presentation and enlightening us on what's going on in Ukraine. I would again encourage audience to use Q&A tab for their questions or remarks. And well, I would like to ask about health-related disinformation, because it is an urgent topic now. And have you been experiencing health-related disinformation in your respective countries? And to what extent has this kind of disinformation been popular? And in your assessment, does it have a political aim? Let's start with Lubov and then Andrei and Lucas. Lubov, please turn on your mic. No problem.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yes, we do see a lot of fake stories and manipulations on healthcare, especially on numbers of sick and dead and treatment fakes. those stories about garlic being the single treatment against the virus. And of course, these stories are especially dangerous because they undermine trust to official figures and to Ministry of Healthcare, which is quite dangerous because people very often choose their own ways of treatment, and it leads to kind of very bad consequences. We see such things again in messengers, especially Viber and Telegram, sometimes on Facebook, and there are some politicians in Ukraine from pro-Russian party, opposition platform for life, which spread this sort of stories, saying, for example, that COVID is not a real disease, that it's kind of fake, and so on. But sometimes these people get sick. And what is interesting, even getting sick and then like being at the hospitals, they after it they go out and still spreading these things about COVID is not real disease and so on. And of course, one more factor is church. In Ukraine, Ukrainian Church of Moscow Patriarchate spreads fake stories that only prayer can help in treatment, and they called people to come and pray during the most dangerous period of the pandemic.
Andrei?
I would say that it's often hard to measure the extent of popularity of specific propaganda narratives. Sputnik Belarus is now in top 10 most popular news outlets in Belarus, but it doesn't mean that those videos which I showed you enjoy this popularity. It's because Sputnik Belarus publishes thousands of neutral news. It combines neutral, high-quality news on many topics with this kind of propaganda content. So we, of course, can track of viewership of these videos and judge from these numbers. Then they show us that these videos are not super popular, but still these propaganda narratives which are embedded in some larger context, in some audio commentary, they can gain thousands, tens of thousands of listeners and views. So when it comes to coronavirus-related disinformation, I'd say that the independent media in Belarus have been doing a great job, but the problem is that the people in Belarus face not only Kremlin-driven propaganda and disinformation, but also domestic one, as the Belarusian state-owned TV channels and online websites consistently downplay the risks of coronavirus in line with the official narrative. So the problem is that the population of Belarus face twofold propaganda, both domestic one and external one.
Thank you, Andrei. Yes, Lucas, what's your take on health disinformation?
Well, again, I guess it's hard to notice what is happening in all of Europe. But what I saw at the moment is that the Baltic states are not getting that much disinfo directly from pro-Kremlin media. And I think it's important to say that disinfo can have two different audiences, right? It can have internal, domestic Russian audience, and it can have external, so the Baltics or Europe in general. And what I noticed is that in this case, Baltics are more targeted as an internal domestic sort of disinformation more than external. What I mean is that the Baltic states are more not the target, but the subject of disinformation for Russian speakers. A good example would be that Russian media has been going non-stop for the past few weeks that the Baltic economies are going to be destroyed beyond repair. And they're casting these bigger narratives and then support it with a lot of small stories. So a big narrative, as I mentioned, can be that the economies will be destroyed beyond repair, and the small stories can be that, for example, due to the current situation, more and more Latvian businesses are turning to Russia, and in the long term, they're going to turn from EU economy to Russian economy. But the biggest threat, I think, for the Baltic countries that we see at the moment are the conspiracy theories. And I'm currently working on a little case about the Facebook groups in Lithuania. And I'm actually shocked how many people are joining and how many people are believing in those. And what is more, I'm very much shocked how different conspiracy theories are being intervened into weird mixes, like 5G, anti-vaccine, Corona. They're all being sort of mixed in together into one big overarching conspiracy theory that, you know, the deep state is trying to control us. But this is very much fascinating, and I think looking at various profiles and supposedly educated people that are joining those groups, I think this is the biggest threat that we have at the moment in the Baltic states.
Okay, thank you, Lucas. Yes, this is also related to what Lyubov has spoken about, and I mean, when talking about Belarus and Ukraine, but now also increasingly about Lithuania and those conspiracy theory groups, a lot of organizing and communication is moving to Telegram and other private messaging apps. So, you know, while in media, while disinformation is in media, so activists can debunk. While disinformation is in social media, you can report fake accounts, you can kind of organize around it. But when it's in private messaging, it seems like it's currently off the radar. Do you have any ideas for policy or civil society actions that could be taken to counter disinformation on private messaging groups? Let's start maybe with Lyubov.
I'm afraid that I don't know about very successful civil society initiatives, but I do know that, for example, Ukrainian security service blocks a lot of such sorts of groups and communities which are spreading hatred and disinformation on COVID and so on. So we get reports from our security service, I think, weekly, and there are many groups which has been analyzed and banned there. About civil society, it's also mostly about tracking and analyzing and reporting, but I think this is the single way we can operate now on this.
Andre?
Victoria, you did a good point. That's it is hard to debunk claims in Telegram because of anonymity, and the pro-Kremlin actors make good use of it. So Telegram has become a very important source of information and disinformation. It is increasingly popular platform among nationals of Belarus. So many pro-Kremlin propaganda outlets run their own Telegram channels, either publicly associated with them or not. So the Telegram, I must say, is increasingly used by these outlets, and I can imagine that in some cases Telegram postings reach much more people than separate website postings.
Okay, Lucas?
Yes. Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to add because I think this is a very highly complicated topic. I would like to mention that there is a very interesting case that I heard about in Poland that not only these traditional usual suspects as WhatsApp or Telegram are being used for this sort of spread of information, but I heard that in Poland, long chains of emails are being sent as well. And this is very interesting because they target a very specific audience in Poland, slightly older people who already know how to use computers. You have the basic computer skills, but they're not, maybe not enough educated in the media literacy. So it's a very interesting way of spreading this info, basically by adding a long list in CC and basically spreading this info like that. But about my thoughts about solving this problem is that if we're still talking about how problematic it is to diminish the activities of Kremlin propaganda media outlets who are publicly connected with Kremlin because of the free speech infringements and questions like that, then this problem is like 5 steps from the other problem, because this directly can infringe of free speech, and then in places like Russia, Telegram in many cases is being used as a source of an actual resistance and spreading actual information. So I think this is a problem we're not going to solve anytime soon.
Right. There is a number of questions from the audience, so we'll start asking those. Virginia Budiana asks, is there a role at all for states in debunking? So maybe let's start with Lucas and then Andrei and Lyubov.
Yes, the role of states as countries.
Yes.
Yeah, I think so. I think that the countries should lead the sort of response, but also very much involve all of the other actors available. So I think that the response that Lithuania and other Baltic countries have, sort of the full country response with NGOs, journalism, even businesses, in many cases, is the correct way to go. But I think countries should be leading the way and sort of leading the charge.
Andrei?
I believe that NGOs, civic initiatives doing great debunking some disinformation claims and so on, but the state's role is indispensable in providing some media literacy programs into educational curricula and so on. This is what we do not see in Belarus yet. Sometimes the state institutions mention their acknowledge the problem of disinformation and so on, but we do not see any consistent steps into implementing some concrete media literacy programs for vulnerable segments of population.
I think it very much depends on the level of penetration of Russian propaganda in your country, because, for example, in Ukraine, when the war started, war with Russia, it was very needed to introduce some policy, and of course, it was a task of our government. So they banned Russian media and Russian social media, which are under full control of Russian, as we know, conducted on the Glasniki Russian security service. So this is like also quite questionable for many countries. Should governments and the state interfere or not? But in our case, I think that we are reaching quite successful coordination in our efforts. I mean, civil society and government. We had few quite successful programs where our efforts were combined with governmentals, and even now I know that Ministry of Foreign Affairs is going to launch its own Telegram and Viber channel for countering disinformation, and again they asked civil society organizations to help and provide some content on it. So I think it might be very nicely combined together, efforts of government and NGOs.
Thank you. Could you provide your assessment on local societies, on their reaction and resilience to Russian disinformation? Let's start with you, Lyubov. How resilient is Ukrainian society to disinformation?
It also depends on many factors. There is a great research conducted by NDI, National Democratic Institute, and it showed that resilience is different by regions. In Ukraine, for example, west and central of Ukraine is more protected, and people are able to distinguish disinformation much better. At the same time, south and the east is quite susceptible for disinformation. In terms of civil society response, I think, yes, we have very nice programs tracking disinformation and informing people about this, but again, it's not at the same level the disinformation we have. Like, it's very difficult because, of course, there are different resources, and you can only imagine how much Russia invests in disinformation. And of course, we are not, we cannot fully counter it. I mean, on national level.
Okay. Andrei?
I'd say that in Belarus, state-owned media are very reluctant to combat propaganda and disinformation. Although in the past month, they started a couple of video programs on state-owned TV, which are poised to debunk disinformation, but in reality, it turned out that most of these programs, reports, target not propaganda, but the contrary, the bad West, and discredit the Belarusian opposition. So we can see that in a number of video reports, these state-owned TV channels address pro-Kremlin and propaganda claims, but it's not taking place on a regular basis. In this situation, the work of the independent media and civil society is very important, and I'd say that they are doing much more in the field than the state authorities. I'd say that the independent media and specialized debunking teams have been doing a great job, and that they are the better shield to protect the country's population from propaganda and disinformation than the state media.
Lucas, what's your take on this? How resilient is society in Lithuania? And if you can answer for the whole Baltics, it's good.
Yeah, it's hard for me to answer. I really don't have any, sociological data on what is happening. And it would be very interesting to look in between how different nationalities and how different language speakers within the countries are resilient to disinfo and so on. But what I can say is more of a zoomed out perspective, and I can compare Baltic countries with Western Europe or the United States, where I have been more in contact with experts there, and I can say that there is a better understanding and better gut feeling, if I may say, of the Baltic countries to suspect what might be propaganda, or not even to believe everything, word by word. And I think that it's due to the history of the Soviet times, and I think we have more similarities with resilience within our neighbors, from Central and Eastern Europe rather than Western Europe and United States.
Thank you. There is a question, I think a burning question about China and disinformation. So in all of the countries, in your respective countries, do you see similar propaganda and disinformation techniques coming from China? Let's start with Lyubov.
In our case, we don't see much influence from Chinese disinformation players, but we do see that our population sees China as quite positively, I would say. According to the survey conducted by Kyiv International Institute of Sociology, almost 46% of Ukrainians believe that China is the country which copes with the COVID quite successfully, and definitely much better than the US or EU or Ukraine. So, but we don't have like really visible Chinese disinformation here.
Okay, Andrei?
The same here. China does not have any popular media outlets that could influence the Belarusian population. So I believe that if it had, then probably it would have some impact, because the overall presentation of China by state institutions in Belarus is quite positive. So I believe that parts of the media consumers would trust the Chinese messages. But so far it's not the case. They just do not have any even marginally popular media outlets in Belarus.
Okay, thank you. Lucas?
Yeah, well, from what I see in the Baltic states, we also don't have very specific dedicated media outlets for Chinese propaganda. But what we noticed from Europe and the wider Western world region, and countries like Italy, is that the techniques are basically more or less the same between Chinese and Russian propaganda creators. The goals are different. The goals, in what do I mean by that, is that the Russian goals are more offensive, and what they're trying to achieve in this situation with coronavirus is they're trying, to disrupt the cooperation between NATO countries, disrupt the belief, in EU and so on. Meanwhile, China is more concentrated in saving their own face, saving the economic influence in different countries, basically to trying to present themselves as the problem solver rather than the cause of the problem. So I think the key here is the goals.
Right. I think this will be the last question, but I would like you all to elaborate on the response of civil society on disinformation during this period. Well, let's finish with a positive note maybe. Has civil society in your respective country also employed tactics to counter disinformation? Have there been any positive examples on how civil society has engaged with disinformation? This is an opportunity to give a shout out to organizations or social media groups or individuals who are doing great work in your respective society. So, Lyubov?
I think we have plenty of cases of successful initiatives coming from civil society. To name just few of them: Stop Fake, Internews, Ukraine World, Inform Napalm, Euromaidan Press. And fortunately, what I see from my perspective, last few years, like maybe 2 years ago, we started finally cooperation and coordination. It was extremely important because we used to do the same and we didn't cooperate enough. So now we share information. We even created some sort of club of fighters against disinformation. It's informal, but we meet once in a while, of course not in times of pandemic, but still we do cooperate with each other. I think it's a great opportunity for us to combine efforts, and we see clearly that it has reflections on government as well. They started inviting us to join to this discussion on governmental level, fortunately, and there are quite a number of very nice initiatives coming from the government.
Great. Andres?
Well, my colleagues from the East Center and iScience Network and myself, we do our best to expose these propaganda efforts and to publish research, monitoring products, some video compilations. I think that's the numbers are telling. Like some our products gets thousands of interactions on social media. So people reached out, people discuss it, and acknowledge the extent of problem that we are facing. So I think this is a good example of importance of the issue that we do our best to raise. But of course, further actions are needed, and there was a good question about attempts to merge or coordinate different debunking teams and initiatives. I think that's more done in this field, and more cooperation between domestic teams and international projects can be implemented to get even larger outreach and to get some more synergy.
Thank you, Andrei. Lucas?
Yeah, well, I can say something from Lithuanian side. All of the organizations that have been active in fighting disinfo before, I think only increased their efforts and started maybe more of cooperation. Lithuanian Elves, Debunk EU, Civic Resilience Initiative, everyone who's all the volunteers who have been working on this, I just maybe changed the focus a bit more and started putting in more effort into this. But this is what has been happening before. My favorite example of what's slightly new is that those Facebook groups that appeared on Lithuanian Facebook that deal in not fighting disinfo, but deal in providing correct information about the coronavirus. So basically, they invited doctors, experts, scientists in those groups to check all the information that is being shared on this group. And in this way, they created these safe information bubbles where people can go there and be 100% sure that they're reading something that is happening or something that is real, and not be influenced by any misinformation or disinformation. So I think this is a very, very interesting new initiative, and I think it's great.
Thank you, Lucas. Thank you, Lyubov. Thank you, Andrei, for joining us today. Thank you, the audience, yes, for joining us here. Do maybe participants want to say any last words before we finish?
I think we were quite positive with our latest points. Yeah, do not spoil it.
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody, and we'll finish now. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you so much.